Welcome to the A to Z of writing language learning materials. If you don't already subscribe to this channel, please do, so you don't miss any of the new videos in the A to Z series. Today's video is T is for text. I'm particularly excited by the guest we have today, a bit of a legend. I'm going to let her introduce herself, but in the video, basically, we're going to be talking about criteria for selecting certain types of texts, how we deal with the issue of authenticity and balancing that with language level, and also the importance of visuals and images that we use with texts. So it should be a really useful video if you're working particularly with reading text, or you're used to trying to find certain text to make your materials more interesting. Anyway, let's go meet this person.
I'm Christina Latham-Koenig. I'm the co-author of the English file series. I've been writing it for quite a long time now, but I still very much enjoy what I'm doing, even though it is rewriting in many cases.
Thank you very much for agreeing to come to this, Christine. The reason it's amazing to be actually talking to you, because I thought when you agreed to be interviewed, we should talk about text, because I used the first English file in the late 90s. I'd been teaching for 3 or 4 years, I think. I'd used Headway, and then the place where I was working switched to English file, and I think we piloted it. And I remember at the time, there was definitely a shift in what texts were like in course books. It'll be interesting to get your reaction, because my perception of the sort of 80s and 90s, writers could just make up texts. A lot of we were still at a stage where if you needed a text to illustrate certain types of language, you could just write it if you couldn't find it in a newspaper and that kind of thing. And we'd only had internet, not that much even by the end of the 90s. So it wasn't necessarily that you were getting that. We were still opening the Sunday newspapers and that kind of thing to find text. But what was noticeable, I think, for teachers was the English file was using more authentic information in the text, but the texts were doing something that was kind of humor in them and so on. And there's a quote, I went digging around for things that you'd said about text in the past, and I found one quote from 2013, which I think is still probably true today. Text must be interesting enough for students to want to read them in their own language. Otherwise, how can we expect students to want to read them in English? Now, you're working on edition 5 of English file now. Do you think that's still true about texts? I mean, what would be your criteria for looking for texts?
I mean, I think it's totally true. And if anything, I'd say it was more true today than it was when I said that, but I absolutely stand by that. I would sometimes see a text in a book that I was either using or thinking of using, which I personally found boring. So I've got to try to find something that is sort of a bit universal, I think, in its way. And it's very interesting to see how over the years, certain topics come up again and again and again in newspapers. So they obviously are topics of sort of universal interest all over the world, and probably all over age groups as well. So when you find that sort of material, you know, it's got to be something that I would instantly want to read, but that also I think that, for example, my daughter or the younger generation would also be interested in. And I think that because today, I think people possibly read less than they used to, then it's even more important to find something that really makes them want to read it.
I mean, we're also talking about listening text, aren't we? In a way, finding
absolutely.
Finding topics. It's the same principles in that sense.
Well, and it's even truer again with listening, because where listening material is audio and not video, that is a means of, or a way of listening that is not very common nowadays. Yes, we do listen to the radio still. We listen to podcasts, but even so, I think that a lot of young people are not really very used to listening to the spoken word without images. And so again, if I say that a text in a reading has to really appeal to a student and make them want to read it. You know, okay, it's a while since I was in the classroom, but my memories from the many years when I was a teacher of walking towards the tape recorder, I suppose it would have been in the early days, or the CD player, about to press the button, and the looks on the student's face in the classroom, which was sort of saying, I'm not going to understand anything, motivating students to listen, again, depends very much on giving them something that you know they really want to find the answer to, or to find out about. And that's partly why I would say in the early years of English File, one of the talks that Clive and I gave was called Guess What Happens Next, because we were very into holding back the denouement of a story or an article or whatever it was, often something from the press, and making that into listening, because we felt that at that point, students really would want to know what happened in the end, as it were.
But this issue of text selection, finding a text that will appeal to, I mean, if you think in the choosing a text in the 90s, I suspect a lot of your English files was used in a lot of European countries, and now presumably it's much even broader than that. So you're talking about finding a text to suit different age groups, different students all over the world. And as you as a writer, you can look at a text and think, well, it interests me, I think it would interest others. But how do you go about checking that? Because it's partly intuition, but you've still got to test it, yeah?
Well, we do get a massive amount of teacher feedback, which has always been super important to us. So, for example, when we're going to write a new edition, first of all, we get teachers to comment, and specifically to comment on the texts and the listenings, the reading and listenings. We get them to comment on all the ones in the previous edition. They score them for interest for their students, and we get teachers from all over the world, so that we do get teachers from not just Europe, but from Brazil, from Mexico, from lots of different parts of the world, Vietnam. And then the texts that are scored lower, that immediately tells us we've got to replace those texts. Even if they're texts that we have a particular weakness for ourselves, we know we've got to replace them. And then we submit the first draft of the new edition back to those same readers, and sometimes to, or even to other readers, who then evaluate the new text. So we do get a lot of feedback from teachers, because I think that's the only way. You know, we can't really judge how well something's going to go down in a country that we don't have much knowledge of. Although that being said, I have traveled a lot talking to teachers, and I find it quite surprising how global a lot of topics are.
When you choose a text and you get feedback from people on the text, do you ever find it hard to let go of a baby? So if you found a text, you think that's gold dust, that's got to work, and then you get some feedback from teachers really push back, do you ever say, no, I'm going to keep it because I'm convinced it's okay?
Sometimes, I have to say, not always, but sometimes I just have to accept, hey, you know, this was definitely not a success. It's not so much, I think actually, if 90% of teachers thought that it was not interesting, then there's no question I wouldn't go for it. It's more when it's 50-50, and then I go with my gut feeling. But again, I can give you an example. There's an interview, and sorry, jumping around a bit, just going back to what you said about everything in English File being real. That has always been, right from the beginning, our absolute #1 priority: not to invent, not to create texts ramming in a structure. Unfortunately, Clive and I were from the beginning obsessive readers of newspapers, and we cut out articles. Like, you know, we had files and files of articles that we thought were interesting, and that was in the early days, and we were both living in Spain, and it was not that easy to get hold of English newspapers, but we both read 2 newspapers every day, as far as we could, and saved any article that we thought had sort of the feeling we wanted. But going back to your question, when we also, all the listenings and interviews are all people we know, people we've met, people who we found out about. And we interviewed someone who actually I'd been at university with, who is a music psychologist. And he was talking about, and he'd written a book called Music and Emotion. And it was about how music affects your emotions and how it feels, how it makes you feel, and really interesting things like that. When you're sad, instead of listening to happy music to cheer yourself up, what people do is actually listen to sad music to sort of wallow in their grief. Anyway, he was really interesting, and he came in and did the interview for us and illustrated it on the piano. Now, when we submitted that to read to teachers the first time, about 50% of them said he mentions a lot of classical music, and that's a no-no for our students. They wouldn't be interested, they'd find it boring. And there we did get, on the other hand, we got 50% who said this is fascinating, our students would love it. But I said there, I want to go with it. And we went with it. And about a year later, I got an email from a teacher who said, I was one of the people who said I wouldn't use this. I've just used it with 2 upper intermediate classes, and they were both absolutely fascinated. So I felt sort of vindicated for having put it in. However, that doesn't mean to say that there are, there's always going to be material that, depending on the nationality of your students and the age group of your students, and that's key, because English files sometimes used with 14-year-olds. There are always going to be students who don't like it. We used to get comments from certain countries, like, for example, Hungary, saying Hungarians don't go to the cinema, which I find difficult to believe. Or from Brazil, I remember saying Brazilians are only really interested in sport. Again, that cannot be true, and we can't write a book all about sport. But you would get these generalizations, but I think that would be from very individual teachers in individual circumstances.
I think we're also always in danger of creating these sort of echo chambers where we're just providing them with more of what sort of somebody generalizes they're going to like. And sometimes we need to put in a new topic that surprises them, that they've never thought about or read about before, and think, oh, that's really interesting, because we should be giving them something that makes think, well, actually, I've never listened to classical music before, but now if I'm going to go off and do that kind of thing, and I think books should do that as well, or materials should do that as well. And there is a danger with the way so much feedback is taken now and things influence the writing, that there's a danger that we don't take those kind of risks. I mean, you must have seen enormous differences between what is generally regarded as acceptable now compared to what it was 25 years ago in terms of text choice, for example, or considerations in text choice.
Totally. I mean, what you said there about giving people things that are new, I think is also key. And this thing about, that you said, that I said about it being something you'd want to read in your own language. Another criteria for me with material is that it should be something that you would actually want to tell somebody else about, and that you'd say, I read something that I'm frequently doing in my own language. I'm saying, I've just read this article in the papers about X, Y, Z. It's often a springboard to speaking. Now, if you couldn't produce an article that gets a student wanting to tell somebody else about what they've just read, again, that is exactly what you're looking for. In terms of things having changed, I mean, I think a lot of things haven't changed. And I find it very interesting how similar topic areas, articles, come up again and again and again over the years, often because some new research has been done in that area. But it brings it. So, for example, the best time of day to do something. The best time of day to do sport or whatever it is. We've used several articles like that over the years, but they're all recent articles when we reuse them that have just come up because new research has been done. But again, that seems like a globally interesting topic, because everybody might find it interesting to know when they are at their most creative or when they are at
Yeah, you can also
But
gauge it by, I mean, some of these topics recap, there's new research and they're re-reported on the radio or on TV, and you know that
exactly,
people are interested because they keep coming back, but some new study has said something about it which demonstrates there is a general broad interest in it. Yeah, absolutely.
absolutely. But I think that with what we're doing now, which is new, or what we can and can't use now, there are areas that are very difficult to use texts on if you're going to publish them. Things that you could use them and take them into the classroom. And that's particularly things that date. So, for example, technology is always an issue. As soon as you use a piece of material about technology, in a few years, you're going to find that it's completely out of date, and that, you know, we've got articles talking about tweets, for example, and Twitter, and already it is no longer Twitter. And I'm not sure if people still do use the word tweets, although probably they do, I think, because there's a lot of X, formerly known as Twitter.
Yeah.
Things like, I don't know, politics, and there are lots of areas where as soon as things are over, people forget about them and they're no longer interesting. So, for example, celebrities date. I'm not a fan of using material about celebrities, but celebrities, although we did in the past use, certainly in the very first editions, but I'm not a fan of that because people, with a few exceptions, for example, sports celebrities, once they stop playing, people completely forget who they are. Once a politician is no longer in the government, I'd be surprised how many people, young people globally, knew who Margaret Thatcher was, who had ever even heard of her. Not necessarily.
No, I'm always astounded when I start to meet students who've really never heard of the Beatles, because I just assume that everybody's heard of them. But of course, it emphasizes how much older I am than my students, and you forget these things change, and also celebrities, particularly geographical, and in the sort of the early course books, they were always pretty Europe based or even British based. And of course, you know, a student in South America had no idea who you were talking about.
Though that being said, I don't think, given that I do think they are of global importance, and that there has been a lot being written and films about them recently, I don't have any problem with talking about the Beatles to people who've never heard of them and making them aware of them and aware of how they changed pop music. I mean, I think that's a good example of what you were saying about telling them something they didn't know about.
Well, that's my reaction. What do you mean you haven't heard of the Beatles? Okay, well, it's time you did. It's
Exactly.
just it's that
I
kind of
completely agree, actually. I remember we doing something in class about them and telling students that the original words for yesterday were scrambled eggs, oh my baby, how I love your legs, which and that was an example of them going out of class and telling somebody else about it. They thought that was incredibly funny.
Well, that is the test, is it? If students leave the classroom talking about it, because I've heard students, I've got the text right and they've wandered out and they might have slipped back into their first language, but it doesn't matter because they're just talking about the topic. And nowadays they're almost looking it up on their phone to see
Exactly.
what, if it's true, and what else can they, particularly if it's about a song or something, they want to hear it and so on. You've got all of that, and that's when you know you've got it right and it resonates.
Absolutely.
Yeah, yeah.
But actually, again, the Google thing, that's another issue for us, in that it's so obvious that students can nowadays Google anything. It's even more of a reason to make sure that everything in our books is authentic, that we are not that they can Google it. Sometimes, a very few occasions, we have got information from multiple sources, for example. You know, let's say it's something like the meaning of dreams or something like that. But what we would never do is, even if we might make that into a listening, we would never put it into the mouth of a person, and we'd never say, Professor blah blah blah,
Blah, blah.
talk about dreams. If we do that, we would only ever say a psychologist or an expert. If we give a name, it's Googleable. Anything where we give specific information, you can Google it, you can find out about it. And I find it slightly annoying, actually, when teachers say, oh, we Googled that, we found out it was true. And I sort of think, yeah, of course it was true.
What do you think? Yes.
Yeah.
But also, and I think in course books now, there is a shift to including the sources, and particularly English for academic purposes materials. That would be standard, that you might give the source of the person who quoted it because it's part of that academic study and so on.
I mean, actually, you have to nowadays. We're not allowed to quote people without it being their exact words. And
also, I think the new development that's interesting is the inclusion of fact checking now of everything that's going into materials. Is an interesting sort of development of all of that.
Do you think it wasn't?
I think probably in the past, if there was a bit of leeway on the facts, it possibly wasn't checked sometimes because it would be hard to follow up. And also you weren't able to check it in 3 different places, for example, in the way you are now. I mean, now if I find out a fact about something that I want to include in text, I can probably check it in multiple ways to be absolutely certain it's true. Because I know, other people are able to do it. So I don't think it's so much that we actively avoided with the facts. It was just we didn't have the ability to check it in all the different ways that we do now.
I'd say editors are pretty good at that, actually. I mean, our editors are very good at fact checking, generally speaking, and they do point
but I mean, I think a new trend in publishers are bringing people who are just dedicated to fact check only. That's becoming increasing.
Yes, well, I think that's a good thing.
That's some of the criteria. I'm interested in your approach, and you touched on this earlier. When you've taken a text, you said that you and Clive, right from the beginning, you didn't want to shoehorn vocabulary and grammar in for the sake of it. But what is your approach if you found an authentic text you really like, but say you're going to put it in a pre-intermediate level? What's your approach to trying to keep the sense of authenticity and adapt it for the level of the students?
I mean, actually, I think that's one of the most interesting challenges about writing material, is doing that. Because I do absolutely feel that somehow you want to keep something of the individuality of a text when you're doing that. I think that, well, first of all, I think that students can understand more complex grammar in a text than what we have necessarily taught. For example, conditionals. They may not have learnt the second conditional, but if they know what if means, or they may not have learnt the first conditional, they know what if means. They can work that out. They can work out passives if they know to be, and they know a past participle because they've done, or because it's the same as the past tense, or because they've done the present perfect. I think that not including grammar that's slightly above their level, I think sometimes editors will say to me with the text, oh, but they haven't done relative clauses yet. Okay, but they know what that means, or they know what who means. They can work this out. So I think you don't need to simplify the grammar as much as you need to simplify sometimes structure, sentences, making sentences slightly shorter. And then in a way, in readings, it is more than anything else vocabulary. But I'm a bit anti the classifying of vocabulary as B2 or A1 or whatever it is, because I think precisely sometimes in order to keep the flavor of the text, you do need to keep some of the words they use. And you can always use a glossary, and students can look them up on their phones. it's not that difficult. But I think that often that is what gives the article its individuality, is that more than anything else. So I think that it's not, I think it can be done, and it's very satisfying actually to be able to do it. And I think that keeping a little bit of the way, the style of whoever wrote it is feasible, and probably is satisfying for the students as well. I think they can feel when something is written in a too basic way. And with advanced text, sorry, but I think there's another misconception with texts, which is that in order to be advanced, they need to be long. And I think that texts that you're going to use in the classroom, often you don't want them to be long because it's going to take up too much class time. And I don't think that length necessarily means means more difficult. The longer the text, the more difficult it is. Yes, they need to be exposed to extensive reading, but they can do that in many other ways and in their own time. But sometimes a very short text, which has been really condensed, is actually more difficult to get to grips with than a longer one. So I think that sometimes, for example, one of the things that we're doing is we're shortening rather than simplifying, certainly with at higher levels. And then another thing I'd say about authentic texts, and authentic's a word I've got a lot of issues with, but anyway, with authentic texts, is that if you read an article in a not very well written newspaper, such as a tabloid, you will find that they are saying the same thing 3 times over again, and really actually all you're doing is removing the fact that they've repeated themselves or expressed themselves in a not very clear way. So I'd say sometimes you're improving on the text.
I think there's a bigger emphasis now, perhaps, well, maybe there isn't, but big emphasis on sort of visuals, the design. When you choose a text, how much are you drawn to it? How important is it that there's an image with it? Or do you often brief for an image to go with it?
Well, first of all, I think having an image is important, because I think that there's no question that the image does draw you in. And if we're trying to motivate students to want to read something, a good image is something that can draw you in. If it's one of the things that we've learned over the years is that it's very difficult to judge what kind of illustration or artwork students are going to like. I think in British papers, there is quite a lot of illustration, cartoony style illustrations with articles, which don't necessarily travel as well as photographs do. We get more criticism of illustration than of photographs, but sometimes I think that the original illustration that was with the article is part of its personality. And so that, going back to what we were saying about retaining the authenticity of the article, sometimes I prefer to keep, The Guardian, for example, uses some very imaginative illustrators with its articles, and we've kept some of those in articles that we've used in the course book, and I think they really enhance the text. But generally speaking, we always try to use the article that was with the text in the first place, the image, particularly with photographs, because usually they've chosen a good image themselves. Sometimes, I suppose, there might be an article that didn't have any illustration with it, particularly when it's a kind of comment article, and then we might brief something that we think will draw students in. There is also the aspect of it looking good, though. You can't forget that when you're using material for a course book, you want the spread to look good, and sometimes an image is going to make it look better. So there is that sort of aesthetic side as well, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think the design, the visuals is as important as ever in terms of motivation and making the student actually want to look at it and read it, and these things are really important. It's all part of the text, isn't it? Part of the genre that you're choosing, that it has that quality about it, and probably more than it ever was, I would think, nowadays, because you're competing with so many things.
If it's true of food that you eat with your eyes, and if it looks appealing, it makes you want to eat it. It's true of everything, really, and I think it's very true of material, and it's true with listenings as well. Often an image is a brilliant way of drawing you into hearing what its significance was or whatever it is. I mean, anything with listening, which is a question of you thinking about something and realizing there's something you don't know but you'd like to find out, that's always going to motivate you to listen.
I realize we're about to run out of time. I just want to pick up last thoughts. Have you made any mistakes in your writing career with text that you think would be useful to share with writers, so things possibly to avoid?
Of course we've made mistakes. If we've had feedback on a book and out of 50 readers, 25% of them have given them a 2 out of 5, then that was a big mistake. not sure I necessarily want to mention specific ones which are still in. But I can promise you that of course we have made mistakes, and we have.
No, but I think the lesson here you're pointing out is this issue of when you write materials and you choose texts and so run them by somebody. I mean, if you're teaching and you're doing it in your own worksheet, you take it into a group of students and you can feel the feedback from that lesson, but also show it to other teachers, get that feedback. And presumably, when you and Clive work together, you're collecting text. I don't know how you wrote the units, whether you wrote them all separately, but you must have sort of sent, oh, I like this text, Clive, take a look at it. What do you think? Kind of thing. I mean, you're working like
Actually,
that, yeah?
everything in English file we've written together, not with Clive so much now because I'm working more with Kate Chamaki at the moment,
Right.
but certainly for the first 3 editions. And also, we sat side by side, each with our own computer, and we argued through every single aspect of every single lesson. We didn't write, there's nothing where one of us did the readings and one of us did the grammar. We've always written everything together, and I've carried on working like that throughout English file. So I think that's really important, and I think that absolutely the text has got to be approved by, number one, by my agreed with my co-author, with whoever I'm writing with at the moment, but then also with I say with my kids sometimes, if it's thinking younger generation. I mean, they're great at saying, me saying, do you think anyone will ever have heard of this or whatever? But and editors as well. So yes, sharing it. So sharing it with other people is crucial. Another thing I'd say that to think about, and this is more not to avoid, but to think about, is there anything in this text that you might take away with you and actually retain in your life? Because the best texts I've ever used are ones where today, even though I used them years, over 10 years ago, I still remember bits of them. There's a text about the people who survive disasters. And it was about plane accidents, things we probably wouldn't be allowed to talk about today because they might be triggering, but by air crashes and the people who survived and research that had been done on them. And it was the nerds who read the information in the pocket in front of your seat in the plane, or the information that's on the back door of your hotel room. Those people are the people who escape because they've read and absorbed that information. And since I read that article and used it in English file, every time I travel by plane, I read the information and I count the number of rows between my seat and an emergency exit. Every time. Okay, that came from an article in English file. And there are other aspects of, I don't know, the way I live that came from articles. Those are those are the star articles for me that affect your life.
I've got to get on a plane in 2 days' time, so now you've made me think I actually better read the piece of paper because I wouldn't normally.
No, and count the number of rows, John. That's the key thing, because the lights might go out in an emergency and you'd be disorientated and you wouldn't know where the exits were.
Wow. And if I taught that lesson with English file, I would have known that, of course. So, yeah. Thanks so much for talking to me, Christina. It's been really interesting. I think writers and teachers out there will be really interested in the sort of the tips and the background to the text, because lots of them will have used English file, and of course lots of them are writing their own materials. So it's how you choose text and what text work is one of those. There isn't really a how-to list. It's one of those slightly intangible aspects of writing when you say, why do you choose a text? And we talk about interest and it can't be boring. And that's sometimes it's quite a tricky one to define what it is that makes it work. And sometimes you just see it and think that's great, but it's not something you can necessarily always pin down. But you've raised some really great points. Thanks very much.
Been a pleasure.
Thanks, Christina, for talking about T as for text. Lots for you to think about there, whether you're an English language teacher, somebody who writes materials for other languages, or somebody who writes materials for any area of education. Lots to think about in terms of text selection, the issue of authenticity, and making text relevant to students. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss more videos in the future.